right, I'm going to get started. This is lecture 23 about policy with behavioral agents, the last lecture of 13, for better or worse. Okay, so what's the plan for today? We're going to talk about paternalism. What is paternalism? Reasons for paternalism, why it might be popular or not. We're going to talk about a specific example of what was coined as libertarian paternalism. I'll explain more, which is to say more tomorrow plan, what's good about this specific example, and we'll discuss that. And finally, we'll talk about market solutions. Often it's sort of one solution that's often mentioned is to say, well, why can't the market solve these kinds of issues? And we're going to talk about why that may or may not be a good idea. Okay, so then let me just ask very simply to start with, from your classes if you've taken in economics and otherwise, what are some reasons for government policies? And it doesn't mean that you necessarily endorse those reasons, but what are reasons why we might want the government to engage in economic or other sort of government policies? So one reason might be that people don't quite know what's good for them, and so we can potentially help them by doing so. That's of course the reason. That's of course what we're going to talk about today. Let me rephrase my question. In neoclassical economics, what are reasons for the government to engage? So the behavioral ones, of course, what we're going to call like internalities, which is essentially people misoptimize in certain ways. But what are the neoclassical reasons for the government to engage? So like this would be things like externalities. This could be individuals causing externalities. Externalities essentially is a fancy word for like people causing some positive or negative effects on others that they might not be able to internalize. This could be smokers or individuals doing that. By, for example, smoking, you might sort of cause health effects on others. Could be also firms polluting the environment or polluting sort of like water or some other sources of other people polluting like and otherwise the air and so on and so forth, which might be bad for others' health. And to the extent that the firm or others are not sort of taking that into account, that'll lead to socially suboptimal outcomes. And now the government would say, well, let's tax that because we want to sort of make sure that people are taking into account these externalities. And with the optimal tax schedule, potentially at least you can get back to the first faster. So at least you can improve off that potentially. So usually the theorems about like free markets, etc., they essentially the free market will achieve that things are efficient or potentially under some conditions, but what the market will not typically achieve is sort of some form of equity. And sort of to the extent that we are interested in that, you might want to engage in social security, insurance program, unemployment insurance, and so on and so forth. So if you have lots of competition, the prices will fall down to often marginal costs, and that's good for consumers because stuff is cheap. If you have only one firm, the monopolist, in the more starkest case, the monopolist will charge above marginal costs. So prices will be higher, fewer things will be sold, and people will be less happy about that. And sort of then there's sort of this the antitrust in 1420, as you say exactly. Nancy Rose and others are working on that. Antitrust commissions, etc., trying to essentially make sure there's sufficient competition in markets because we think that's good for welfare. So there's other sort of market failures, for example, public goods, parks, and so on. The government might want to provide that because in general people might under provide that. Could be also other things like information. Markets for information tend to fail. The reason being that when I come up with an idea that's useful for a lot of people, I might not be able to internalize the rents from that, and sort of I'm underinvesting therefore in R&D and so on. So now I think we have all the things I have on my list. There's macroeconomic policy, as Chad just mentioned. The Federal Reserve might set try to influence interest rate. There might be fiscal stimulus, competition policy. That's what Edwin just mentioned. Then there's redistribution, social insurance. I think that's what Justin said, unemployment insurance, social security, and so on. And then there might be externality. That's what Natalie said, cigarette taxes and other sort of market failures, such as innovation. That's I think what Jose as well said. What we're going to focus on now is none of these things, which, and that's getting back to what we said at the very beginning, which is internalities. So that's not a traditional way for governments to engage in. And if you went back like 20 years from now, the government, that there would be no such, or very few such considerations. But more recently, in part perhaps because as a consequence of the rise of behavioral economics, people are much more interested now in internalities. So what are internalities? It's essentially sort of similar to X, and the coin is very similar. Instead of causing damage or not internalizing sufficiently effects on other people, this is now effects on your future self, essentially. And so that the consumer does not fully or properly internalize all the costs and or benefits she imposes on her future potential self. And if the government is sort of not confident that that's the case, well, then the government might want to intervene. Now, what's paternalism? Paternalism is essentially a version of that. There's a very convoluted definition by the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which I'm not going to read to you, but it's, at least one definition. There's a better one from David Leibson, which is an attempt to influence or control people's conduct for their own good. In other words, when the motivation for the intervention is not about externalities. So it's to say, if we try to affect people's behavior for their own good in some ways. And that sort of assumes, of course, that people are not fully optimizing in certain ways, not when it comes to like their effects on others, but rather the effects on themselves in the same. Okay? Sorry, there was a question? Now, when is paternalism warranted? We can sort of go through the list of topics that we discussed in the class. And it's important to understand that like not all of these topics are in fact warranting intervention. For example, if you think people have certain risk preferences, reference-dependent preferences, or social preferences, that's not a bias or problem that we need to fix. People care about others, and that's just the way their utility function is like. And then you kind of make sure that people can optimize optimize accordingly. That's not necessarily a bias or a problem. Of course, if there's problems with self-control problems where people have time inconsistent preferences, we might want to sort of help people. That assumes, of course, that we know which self is the one we want to support. There's lots of space here when you think about non-standard beliefs for people to make mistakes or for governments and others to intervene. This would be limited attention, also things like memory, where people just forget stuff, learning failures, where people just have wrong information, over-optimism, overconfidence, projection and attribution bias. These are all essentially people that make mistakes in some ways, and to the extent that they make these mistakes, we might want to intervene. Importantly, we discussed this already, motivated beliefs are not necessarily a reason, or we want to be very careful with that. That is, as we said previously, when we talked about health issues, for example, so if somebody does not want to know their health status because they want to feel happy or make themselves think that they're happy, and they don't want to know that because they want to have a few years of their lives in which they think can delude themselves into thinking they're happy, they're healthy and happy. It's not obvious that they're making a mistake, in the sense that they could be making a mistake because potentially there could be health investments or health behaviors that they could engage in to improve their behavior. But it could also just be that, look, there's actually not much one can do. And so now if you intervene, we might actually make things worse because there's somebody who actually doesn't even want to know what's going on. That's often that's actually the case. But I'm sort of just flagging that for motivated beliefs, when people derive utility from beliefs, things get tricky quite easily. And then we talked about non-standard decision-making, gender discrimination. There's a clear case for intervention if people don't get treated the right way as they should, or any other discrimination. And then we talked about these other aspects here. Of course, then defaults, frames, and nudges are not sort of necessarily reasons to intervene. These are more like instruments that we can use to intervene. We can sort of set defaults or frames or nudges in certain ways that help us to make people make different choices in ways that are potentially fairly cheap, and then also in ways that don't really necessarily distort behaviors of everyone. I'm going to get back to that in a second. And then it comes to like poverty and mental health. These are more like aspects where we say if poverty affects people's decision-making and causes behavioral biases or low productivity and so on, then things like cash transfers or the Y might help. That's necessarily, I'm not sure that counts as like paternalism. That's more like sort of support programs. And then things like happiness and mental health. Here you could think about if you think people are misoptimizing in certain ways, if they sort of underuse psychological services, or if they sort of misoptimize in various ways. But we think, they could be experimenting more, they could be doing more things to improve their own happiness. Perhaps there's some ways in which we could push people to experiment more and try to figure that out. Notice that I'm sort of careful here in my wording. I'm saying pushing people to experiment and trying things out, as opposed to like pushing people to do certain things. For example, if we say people should be working more, and they should be working less and more hours, it's very hard for the government to actually understand what's good and bad. But it could be like people are maybe working too much, and we could sort of push them towards trying to think about it and then see do they want to experiment and sort of learn more. Could they perhaps be happier by doing so? Any questions on this? So then there's different forms of paternalisms that you can think about. There's hard paternalism and there's soft paternalism. Now, what's hard paternalism? Essentially forcing choices on people, changing prices significantly, mandate choices or procedures, outlaw products, or including taxes. So you think of taxes as sort of changing prices. You can make things cheaper. You can make things more expensive for people. You can subsidize things. You can outlaw products. Like hard paternalism, and you're really significantly changing people's optimization problem in pretty harsh ways by essentially changing prices, potentially making some options infinitely expensive, right? It's just to say, look, I'm just not allowing you to buy certain goods. You can think of the price as just being infinitely expensive for those goods. So that's hard paternalism. Now, in contrast, there's other forms of soft paternalism. There's two versions of that. There's what's called libertarian paternalism, which is what Thaler and Sunstein are known for, which are essentially policies that constructively influence behavior while preserving or nearly preserving freedom of choice. But that's essentially nudges that we talked about previously. That's essentially just saying, like, you can choose whatever you want, but I'm trying to influence your behavior in certain ways that push you towards some options or some outcomes that we think are better than others. Right? Notice that the government or the policy maker needs to be very clear on what's good and what's bad, and then sort of try to understand, okay, we think here's some good behavior that we have identified. Let's now try to push you towards that direction. But since we're kind of unsure what people want, we're not sort of trying to exclude some option for some people because you might make things worse for some people, but instead just try to push you towards that. Very much related to that is what's called asymmetric paternalism. This is the term from Kammerer et al., which are policies that help people who make mistakes while interfering minimally with people who behave optimally. That is to say, you want to be careful if you see people doing certain things, you want to be careful not to make things worse for some people. Suppose there's some people, for a share of the people, like half of the population is sort of behavioral agents, they make a bunch of mistakes, and half of the population doesn't make mistakes at all. Now you could say, and some people are smoking and some people are not smoking each of these. You might sort of say, well, the smokers are making mistakes, the behavioral smokers are making mistakes, so let's help them so they can attack smoking. Right? Now what's going to happen is, well, you might sort of improve some outcomes for those people, and that might be good. But there will be other people who just like smoking and they're just very happy to smoke, and they know that they're health risks, but they decide to smoke anyway. If you now start attacking smoking, you're going to distort their choices and make things worse off for them. So in particular, asymmetric paternalism is trying to avoid that by essentially saying, like, look, we will try to come up with some policies to make things better for some people, but we want to be very careful not to make things worse for others, in particular people who are already optimizing anyway. Okay? And so libertarian paternalism is a version of that, or it's just very closely related, which is essentially to say, if you preserve or nearly preserve freedom of choice, then it often follows that you're not going to make things worse for people who are optimizing anyway, right? Because if somebody's optimizing anyway, and I'm just essentially sort of just providing you small nudges one way or the other, then often I'm not going to make things worse for people optimizing anyway. That's not necessarily always the case, but it's pretty much closely related. I'm saying there could be some people who just smoke. They have like 5 cigarettes a day, 1 cigarette a day, and there could be suppose there's two types of people. There's one type of people who are essentially making mistakes. They have internalities in the sense they misunderstand the consequences of smoking for their future self. Right? These are people who make mistakes. Now, those people we might want to help by increasing the price of smoking, by taxing it, or in other ways. Okay? But there could be other people who essentially are fully aware of the consequences of smoking for the future health. And those are optimizing, and they're essentially in the optimization to decide that smoking is optimal for them.
Okay, cool.
Those people might be made worse off by cigarette taxes because essentially what you do with those taxes or any other taxes, you distort people's behaviors. And then we have a situation where we have potentially made some people better off, but also other people worse off. And a lot of people would then be upset or like unhappy about this because we say like, look, there's people who screw up their choices or they don't know what they're doing. We're trying to help them, but now that comes at the cost of others who are actually perfectly optimizing, and in some sense that gets you in trouble because there will be unhappy people on the other side of it, and potentially quite a few of them. All right. So what are now arguments against paternalism, or why is paternalism bad? You might sort of say that sounds all pretty good, but like now if you try to actually implement this, what's bad about it? Okay, so one typical argument is to say, well, people make mistakes. Well, the government is made out of people, and so how do we know that the people who are in the government actually know better than people choose for themselves? And so if then the government is also making mistakes, then essentially choosing for others is not clear that it makes things better, or it could make things worse, in particular if you think that the government doesn't have enough information. So I know what's best for me, and so therefore I'm best equipped to make decisions for myself. Because you might potentially, particularly if there's heterogeneity, we might make some people better off, but that might come at the cost of some others. And then it's not clear that on average or overall we're making things better. And that's a very important in particular that comes up a lot in, if you take 1475, for example, which is political economy, that would come up a lot. While we might want to help people, we want to give people money, but then the government gets essentially, the village government or whatever gets like captured by elites and keep the money for themselves. And so the more we give, the more opportunity we give for that by giving the government resources and power, the more opportunity we give to for misuse and corruption and so on and so forth. Right. So that's essentially saying that. So there's one class of argument is to say, well, even if the government wanted to do the very best for people, if the government wanted to optimize for its citizens, that would be hard to do because it doesn't know how to do that, or there's inherent problems with that because of heterogeneity, knowledge issues, and so on and so forth. And then there's a second type of argument, which Chad just mentioned, which is, well, who's there to say that the government is actually benevolent and actually wants people to be better off? Maybe they just want to get rich and so on and so forth. And so now if we let them make choices, then that opens the door for corruption, misuse of money, and so on and so forth. So there's sort of a slippery slope argument to say, well, there's some things, which I'm going to argue, for some things, it's pretty clear that we can make things better or make some people at least better off without hurting others. And there's some cases where you say, well, let's have the government do that or whatever, the set policies that help people. By the way, it doesn't have to be necessarily the government, but also be like companies. But then, might say, well, once we start with like some things, then they're going to do more and more things. And at some point, they reach points where like the government actually doesn't know what they're doing, and then they make things worse off. So I have a bunch of different arguments here. I think you mentioned quite a few of them. There's informational issues, sort of not understanding preferences. People are optimizing anyway. This is what Carmen said, or we discussed previously, that some people's choices might be distorted. So these are issues of heterogeneity often. Then there's sort of the government is terrible and wastes money anyway. The government doesn't have like people's best interest in mind. This regulatory capture, I think this is also what Chad mentioned. freedom of choice. Then there's some other arguments, which is freedom of choice matters per se. That's a little trickier to address, but you say, look, it's just, I want to choose for myself and I don't want the government to tell me anything. And that's important by itself. This is not about the outcome. This is about the freedom of choice mattering itself. Then there's similarly, there's arguments about people just don't like hard paternalism. They just don't like to be told or like certain options to be excluded for various reasons, perhaps partially because they don't want the government to be powerful. And then finally, there's some sort of practical problems, which is, once we agree that we want sort of some paternalistic policies, which policies should we choose, and how do we know which is better than another? I'm going to get back to that in a bit as well. There's also practical implementation problems, just to say the government, even if the government wanted to do the right things, the government is often like inefficient and so on and so forth, and so it's just costly to do, and practically it's just hard to do certain things. Now, what are arguments in favor? I'm going to just speed things up a bit. So the arguments in favor are often like very simple, which is to say people make mistakes, people screw up, and we can help them potentially screw up less. People often also don't like to necessarily make choices for themselves. That could be just because they don't like doing it. It could also be just it's costly to do that. And that's just, there's some activities that are just hard to do. And I'd rather have somebody regulate this for me as opposed to like me having to choose or make these choices all for myself. An example would be, suppose, there's like insurance plans or some form of like retirement plans and so on. If there's some options that are just terrible and they just would be exploiting me and making me worse off, I could probably figure it out if you gave me these plans and like I spent like a day studying them. But I have like better stuff to do, and I'd rather have somebody else screen out sort of the bad plans and sort of then offer me sort of the choices that try to not exploit me, and then make maybe some choices from a limited set. That's not to say I couldn't do it, but it's just sort of saying it's inefficient for me to deal with these things on my own. Now, and then finally, and this is I think one of the most important arguments, is that there are a lot of soft paternalism regimes where people can opt out and are unaffected potentially. So when you go back to like the previous concerns that people might have, these are often arguments against hard paternalism. These are often things about like government wasting money and so on and so forth. If this is about like sending reminders or like phrasing letters in one way versus another in some simple ways, or putting food or putting apples next to like the counter versus like candy bars, this is not sort of about the government taking over or like restricting people's free choice. It's rather to say we're trying to make people better off in some simple ways to do. And so a lot of these criticism or arguments go away once you go into like soft paternalism territory. And so then at the end of the day, I think it's hard to make arguments often for paternalism because you need to be very confident things right. It's much easier to argue for soft paternalism, simple policies that are not expensive, that arguably are not hurting a lot of people, but make at least some people better off. Now I think, so this is a little hard to see maybe, but sometimes it's actually quite hard to figure out whether people are making mistakes. This is, for example, here, a survey from Gallup that looks at Americans and looks at like people who call themselves very or somewhat overweight versus the percentage who are overweight and obese by some standards by the CDC and so on. And so here you see essentially that people tend to, that the fraction who are obese, this is in the US, tends to be quite high and tends to be increasing, but people's perception of that might be not necessarily the case. Now, in some ways, like, who are we to sort of say that people should change their behaviors or that they're making mistakes? So in some situations, at least, it's quite tricky to figure out what's a mistake and what's not, and what should we do or not. And again, you get into tricky issues when it comes to particular for different selves and self-control, where, again, who are we to say that somebody should lose weight or change their behavior in certain ways, when perhaps that's not in their best interest, or that's not what they're doing. Maybe they're fully optimizing, and how would we even know that that's not the case? Now, what are some forms of paternalisms that are quite popular? There's lots of examples of, in fact, quite popular paternalism. There's Social Security, there's healthcare programs for retirees, including Medicare, which tends to be quite popular. There's often restrictions of investment menus and 401k savings plans. where essentially that's precisely what I was just saying, is where essentially just bad plants or dominated plants are often just excluded. There's often consumer safety regulations that the FDA has, where essentially certain drugs cannot be offered, or like you cannot take certain drugs. The government essentially just sort of exclude them if they're not being safe. There's mandatory education in many places. You have to go to school. You can't just sort of say, I'm just sort of, my kid is sort of learning in the forest. That's sort of not an option. Often that's to do with also like protection of minors in some ways. Then there's cigarette taxes, or sin taxes, as they're often called. That's also hard paternalism. Notice that here you're changing people's prices. In many places, prostitution, polygamy are banned. These are like hard bans. So you're just not allowed to like marry 3 spouses. Mandating face mask, interestingly, it seems to be that's hard paternalism, as you have, for example, in Cambridge. I think that the punishment is currently $300 if you go outside and don't wear a face mask. I'm pretty sure in Cambridge that's quite popular. Notice, of course, that's not true in all states and so on. So there might be even some policies that are very much popular in some places, but not at all in others. There's also some soft paternalism that tends to be quite popular. There's some places where like it's not clear whether it's like hard versus soft paternalism, what exactly the definition is. Things like banning junk food in school vending machines. You can call that sort of hard paternalism because you take away options, but of course it doesn't really prevent you from bringing in candy to school anyway. So like call that hard or soft paternalism. I don't really care, but that tends to be quite a popular policy. Calorie disclosure laws, which essentially just sort of saying like you have to put in some information for our customers, which could be easily available. You could just look it up online or the lake. And things like default enrollment in 401k savings plan all tend to be quite popular. Now, and for some goods, you know, there's like huge taxes. For example, cigarette taxes tend to be extremely high. This is from 2019. Notice that there's huge variation across places. If you look at like, you know, some places here, these are like some of the highest, such as Connecticut, including Massachusetts. It's $3-4 per pack of cigarettes. In addition, there's also like $1 from the federal government. Then there's some other places, including, you know, North Dakota, or like North Carolina and so on, where cigarette taxes are extremely low. So that's kind of quite interesting, because it sort of, it says, you know, here's a policy that depending on your view of how people make choices, governments make very different decisions, and presumably that has to do with like freedom of choice, or the popularity of that choice itself in the specific state. Of course, it also has to do with potentially the party and so on. Similarly, there's also vast variation in state alcohol taxes. They're in fact, they vary like hugely. Particular sort of, you find some states where like the taxes per gallon are like, you know, $20-30, and some other states where it's like essentially close to zero. Notice that there's also a bunch of other blue laws, as they're referred to, which is things like on certain days you're not allowed to sell alcohol, and so on. Now that's kind of interesting, because that's sort of additional restrictions, which would tend to be quite inefficient in various ways. That is to say, so the economists would tend to think that like if there's certain behavior that we don't want people to engage in, we should tax it. Instead, you could essentially sort of outlaw it in certain ways. That tends to be quite inefficient, because often people find ways to get it anyway, plus the government does not get any taxes or revenue from that. Now, what are some unpopular paternalism or things that people don't like? Quickly, I think that's exactly right. So one of them is helmets and seatbelts. So there, often there's no externality here. This is essentially just like something to protect yourself. Now, they tend to be quite unpopular in many places. It's not quite clear why that is. So often it's sort of a thing that's not cool, or like a sort of some social norms, or in some ways where people sort of think it's like not a thing they want to do. So like sort of explaining to my 14-year or 15-year-old niece to wear like a helmet is sort of very hard. And then she would say, yes, yes, but then like drive around, like ride her bike around the corner and then take it off and sort of, and so on. So that seems to be about sort of something about personal trade-offs between risk and rewards in some ways, where the government or some people might just not value the benefits of looking cool or whatever sufficiently or as much as the individual itself, and then they tend to be sort of unhappy about it. Of course, the alternative way of putting this is that the individual itself is underestimating the risk potentially of doesn't take into account how bad it would be to actually have a bicycle accident or the like, right? But that's essentially something about people disagreeing with the government or with their parents or the like about the risk versus reward or cost benefits of certain actions. And there seems to be disagreement, and then you could sort of mandate that, but that leads to unhappiness because there's precisely that disagreement. Now, the wearing masks is in some sense quite similar. There, it's quite different. And what's different here is that there's externalities, right? So the externalities here are that certain people benefit a lot from having their shops open or like being able to sell things. And others are affected a lot. So in particular, the elderly might be disproportionately affected and sort of might essentially the number of people who will die will clearly increase if people are not wearing masks or if shops are not, if people are running outside or meeting and so on and so forth. But there's others who are really, for whom that's really costly because their businesses are not open and the like. Now, there could be entirely rational issues where you might say, well, people just don't care about certain other groups of the society, and therefore you want to have your shop open, and you don't want to be told that you should be doing that. There could be also mistakes in the sense that people just don't understand necessarily these externalities. They might sort of say, well, I'm not affected and I'll be just fine. That might be actually true. The risk for themselves is not that high, but of course there's large externalities and others that they might sort of not appreciate or not take into account. Exactly. So Chad, Carmen is saying speed limits similarly are similar to that because they're sort of like I'm driving, but there's effect yourself, but also in certain accidents. And so, why is that, or what? So, how do we think about them? To say, so I mentioned here, and this is an example. So here we have we think sort of signal access are quite popular. And why is that popular, and why is the making certain drugs illegal? Why is that unpopular? What's the problem here? So I think there's, when you think about when you do like economic analyses of that, there's essentially, you can think of there might be externalities. Externalities might actually much lower than for smoking or drinking because drunk driving and so on is very lethal. There might be also some externalities from smoking weed, but the externalities are surely low for drinking. Now then there could be internalities, but again, for internalities, usually the solution would be just sort of the typical sin taxes and so on. Where you would say, well, if you want to tax it, sure, but then you at least would get some revenue. You would increase the price, you would get some revenue for the government, plus you would lower people's consumption. In addition, there's all this stuff about like locking people up unnecessarily by making it illegal. Essentially, you create like a large prisoner population and so on, which surely is for society. So once you sort of have like this policy, there's actually not a lot of reasons for outlawing. Often these are sort of tend to be sort of gut reactions or some sort of the judgments that were made at some point. And there's some lobby arguing in favor of alcohol and maybe less of a lobby arguing for other drugs. But as you say, the sentiment has very much changed, and it seems to be like sooner or later, pretty much all states are moving towards legalization, and that leads to essentially potential government revenues as well. So I think one argument perhaps that one could make is sort of these gateway drug arguments, which, I don't think there's actually that much evidence for that, where you say, well, actually sort of marijuana might not be so bad by itself, but perhaps it leads to like other words. It's not obvious at all that legalization of that. So it's not obvious that that's necessarily true. but B, it's all obvious that making it legal versus illegal changes that rationale, because when it's illegal, lots of people are using drugs anyway, and maybe it makes it even more active and maybe sort of more dangerous potentially. But I think it's important to sort of realize that some of these policies are very much like sort of in some ways arbitrary, and, based on some legacy or some lobbies and so on and so forth. And what's important here is then that the popularity itself then also will affect policies in some ways. So like, as you say, the public sentiment has shifted in various, in some ways, stuff will become legal as a result of that. And once you do it in some states and things seem fine and the states make a bunch of money from it, a lot of other states eventually will follow suit. In part because it's also, much harder to enforce certain laws if you have a bunch of surrounding states where you can buy stuff legally. And that makes it, of course, trickier than to sort of enforce the law anyway. I have some other unpopular examples of popular paternalism, junk food bans, junk food taxes, and some of these things again are changing over time. So like, it might well be that things are different in 10, 20 years from now. Gambling laws, pornography laws, other kinds of sin taxes, mandating face masks, again, in some states are just really, really popular, and people on the streets protesting against it, which is quite interesting to try and understand what it might be. But often it is the case that there are some forms of, that there's real economic interests behind that often, and perhaps, again, that could be very much fully rational. It could also be that people might misunderstand the externalities that are at play. There's some other sort of kinds of hard paternalism that's also kind of unpopular and also not a particularly efficient thing to do, which is things like the ban on 16-ounce sodas, which is kind of like a weird thing to do if you think about it, because you can just buy smaller bottles of the lake, which tends to be quite inefficient overall. Here's a signs for seatbelts. Now, okay, so here's the legalization, which also does massive variation across states. Now, there's some nudges and some policies have massive impacts, and we studied at least some of this. For example, this was automatic enrollment. There's essentially a huge swing towards that. Essentially, lots of companies and so on are now using that, and the fraction of people who are participating in retirement plans is way higher than the fraction of people when there's voluntary. There's other policies which are quite simple policies, which are things trying to get people to appear in court. These are essentially lots of people who have to appear in court for like initial court hearings tend to not show up in those meetings. And as you can imagine, that's not a great idea, because that essentially leads to like potentially really bad consequences. Now, what you can essentially just do is try to do very simple policies, and there's a very nice paper by Obelius and others who looks at this. You can sort of change the forms, you can phrase things differently, that essentially tries to nudge people in the right direction. You can also do things like text message reminders, and the text message literally just says, your court date is on May 22 at 9 a.m., please show up. And you remind people to do that. And what you get essentially is that you get large decreases in timely court appearances or non-appearances, where the fraction of people don't show up in court to their own court hearing decreases a lot by using very, very simple policies. Once you do those kinds of policies, presumably much to say against this policy, in the sense that you might say, well, so A, you're not restricting anybody's choices. You're also not really making anybody worse off by sending some text message reminders. There might be some small inconveniences of receiving these text messages, which are kind of annoying and spam for some people. But overall, like, nobody's really made off by this. It's a very cheap thing to do. So there's not a lot of arguments against such policies where you say, look, here's a policy that's extremely cheap to do. Some people are benefiting. Presumably showing up in court is a good thing for your court hearing. and it's a cheap thing to do, and the benefits are potentially large because you now prevent some people from essentially ending up in jail for too long or for unnecessary time because they failed to appear to their hearings. Okay, but so then I think it's also important. So there's some examples that essentially show large effects, including automatic enrollment, including things like text messages or some interventions to induce court appearances. But it's important to understand that not everything always works. What you sort of see often, or what I've shown you, are examples of successful examples of stuff that works. But there's some examples just don't work at all. So here's an example of a clinical trial, which is called the Heart-Strong randomized clinical trial, which gave people essentially like a kitchen sink of things that we think are all good things to do. This is stuff like reminders, financial incentives, social support, and so on and so forth for people essentially who had heart attacks, by giving them like wireless models, lottery-based incentives, and again, social support by sort of having friends and family to help them. And essentially that did exactly nothing for people and sort of had no effect whatsoever. So it's not to say that like we think like everything works always and like we should just always nudge people and provide incentives and so on and so forth. It's something that like might work, but in fact, there's no reason to think that it might always work. In some situations, this might be helpful, and others not. More concerningly, there's also recently, there's a very recent paper from Stefano Lavigna that just came out like a week ago that looks at academic studies and nudge units. That's to say, what they're trying to do is look at treatment effects in academic studies that are published in papers, which are papers like the stuff that we saw on default effects and so on, which is Carroll et al. Is one of the 401k savings one. Here's the study on FAFSA enrollment that I showed you. There's some changing order of menu orders in buffet line for healthier food consumption. So there's a bunch of sort of papers that usually you would teach in like a typical class. And what you see here is on the x-axis, or sorry, on the y-axis, you see treatment effects in percentage points. On the x-axis, you see the control group take up, which is to say, if you don't do anything, what does the control group do? And what you see is pretty large effects in many of these studies that are published. There's some questions on this is like U-shaped or inverse U or whatever. Let's ignore that for a second. But overall, what you see is pretty large treatment effects in these situations. When you then look at, and this is like 26 trials and 71 different nudges here. When you instead look at nudge units, so what are nudge units? These are essentially, for example, the UK government has the what's called the BIT, the Behavioural Insights team, which essentially is a team inside the UK government that tries to support or like nudge people to make better choices. And that's very much sort of like coming from the nudge movement, from Thaler and so on, that sort of like advised the UK government to set this up. And they're now nudging away because the government is really happy about cheap stuff that doesn't cost very much but potentially has like large benefits. Now, what they then also do often is they evaluate their interventions, in part because they try to figure out what works best. Now, when you look at these interventions, you see essentially that the treatment effects in those kinds of interventions tend to be much larger than on the left. If you look at the right, there's a bunch of stuff, bunch of points that are pretty high, above 10, 20%. When you look to the right, essentially, you see almost everything is between 0 and 10%. A lot of it seems to be not statistically significantly different from 0. So that should give us some pause in the sense of like we should be careful and sort of necessarily recommending a bunch of stuff to governments and saying like we should always nudge and so on and so forth. What's going on here? Well, some of this could be about publication bias. Like essentially there's a bunch of studies that are being run and what's being published is essentially stuff that's highly significant and flashy and important. There could be also issues with implementation, that maybe what's done with researchers is sort of implemented better potentially. And maybe what's done at scale is just harder to do in nudge units and harder to do carefully, and then the effects might be lower. Not to say that governments shouldn't nudge in the sense of like, if there are effects of the order of magnitude of something like 5%, and that's really percentage points, and that's really cheap to do, you should probably do it anyway. But it's just the same. Nudges are not a magic bullet that sort of change everything, and the government should always engage on them. And it's quite important, in fact, for the government or governments or any sort of these policy units. And firms, by the way, do the exact same thing to try and figure out what works and what doesn't, and not just rely on the academic evidence that might sort of be more proof of concept rather than sort of something that evaluates cost effectiveness. Any questions on this? Now, another question, this is a little blurry. Another question you might ask, you might have seen these kinds of letters before, whether everybody wants to be nudged. And so there's a very famous study by Alcott and others that looked at energy comparisons. That's a study done with O-Power, the company that essentially tries to sort of reduce energy usage. And the way this works is what you do is you send people these kinds of letters, and I'm getting these letters too, that sort of says, here's your energy consumption in the last month, the last year. Here is all of your neighbors. So it's a comparison. You see the blue bar is like how much did you use, then the gray bar is like how much did all of your neighbors use, and then there's the green bar that sort of says how much do efficient neighbors use. And then there's like smileys where you have like 2 smileys if you're doing great, 1 smiley if you're doing good, like this fellow here, and then there's no smiley, I guess, if you're not doing well. Sometimes there's also like a sad smiley if you're using lots of energy and so on. And so then there's essentially what this is trying to do is trying to provide some social comparison here. It's a very cheap policy to do, in particular, when you're sending sort of energy bills anyway. It's very cheap to sort of add this at the top, where essentially you're sending people energy bills anyway, and now you're sort of adding the social comparison to try to nudge people to use less energy. There's a question of why the company might do that, but that's sort of like a separate issue. And what you see here is when you look at when you look at treatment effects, there tends to be clear treatment effects, at least some treatment effects of providing this kinds of information reduces overall energy consumption in RCTs that people have. Now, one question you might ask is, well, shouldn't we then always do this? So what's the reason not to do that? And it turns out not everybody wants to be nudged. And so here's an intervention where now, again, Alcott and co-author have now, in fact, asked people about, would you like to receive these letters? And what they ask is, or would you like to receive these kinds of social comparisons? And what they ask is, what's your positive willingness to pay for it? So would you like to have $1 versus these reports? Or so $1 and no reports versus just receiving the reports? What is people's willingness to pay? But they also ask their willingness to pay not to receive these reports. That is to say, I could either tell you, I would ask you, like, you receive $1 and no reports, or you receive $0 and no reports, or you receive $1 and the reports. And some people sort of turn that down, which essentially implies that they'd rather have $1 less and no reports. They're willing to pay not to receive these reports. And this is what you see here on the left is essentially people's willingness to pay for home reports. So there are quite a few people here on the right who have positive willingness to pay. They think it's kind of useful, it's kind of interesting, maybe it helps them reduce their energy consumption, maybe that motivates them in certain ways. But some people are just like saying, essentially, I do not want these reports. The reason being that essentially it's kind of just annoying to like get nagged all the time. If you want to sort of, maybe in some cases you just don't have a lot of choice. In some cases, maybe you just like to use lots of energy for whatever reason, and it's really annoying to be told all the time that your like neighbor is really better than you are. Makes people just uncomfortable and makes them unhappy and so on and so forth. Maybe it makes them feel guilty. Who knows? Maybe just don't want to think about it. But importantly, there are some people who just do not want to be nudged. And I think that's important because, you know, when you think back about the libertarian paternalism or the soft paternalism criteria, asymmetric paternalism that we talked about, well, what the asymmetric paternalism would say is we should not make anybody worse off. So now if you send all these letters and make actually people feel uncomfortable, then in fact we are potentially making people worse off. And you can think about some other types of intervention. If you think about, if you got like letters from MIT tells you all the time how you're doing compared to classmates of study efforts, in terms of like problem sets, in terms and so on. Potentially, that would likely increase study effort in some ways, and we would perhaps increase learning in some ways. But it's not clear at all that we would increase welfare, because maybe everybody would be even more stressed and everybody would sort of be less happy and so on and so forth, at least in some cases. Yeah, so actually, so Jenna is asking a question about like who's unhappy about this. I think, well, so the asymmetric paternalism is just to say, suppose there are some people who are just very happy with their choice about using logic, and they just don't want to be nudged. They don't want to, they're fully rationally choosing this. Maybe they know sort of deep down in their heart that it's bad to like ruin the planet and climate and so on and so forth, but they really made a choice that they want to use lots of energy. Those people are not the people who want to receive any letters. So asymmetric paternalism would say we should just leave them alone. They should just be doing whatever they want to do. And us sending them letters to make them feel bad if they don't even change their behavior anyway, or even if they would change their behavior, that's not for us to say, and we should just leave them alone because we make them worse off by receiving these letters, by the revealed preference to say they're willing to pay not to receive these letters. Now, there could be some situations where people who have potentially large treatment effects, these are people who use lots of energy and they just don't know about it. And those we want to sort of send them letters and push them. But I think the whole point of the paternalism, asymmetric paternalism, is to say we shouldn't make anybody worse off. So if somebody reveals to us by their preference, which is what these fellows are doing here, that they really don't want to receive these letters, we should respect that. And sort of one potential solution here is then to say, well, why don't we just let people opt out, where you just say, okay, you send people these letters and maybe you have to click on something, or like you have to sort of opt in or opt out. And then maybe people who really don't want to receive these letters, we can essentially just let them be. There's no judgment here in terms of like, is that socially, like, what do we want to do? And is this a good or a bad thing? This is just to say we should respect people's preferences in certain ways. Does that make sense? Now, the next question you might ask is, well, what form should paternalism take? And that's, I think, something it's important because, you could take 401k savings policies. You can come up with lots of different options in which you could design your 401k savings policies. You could say, you could have like active decisions, you could have defaults for participation, you have like defaults plus information, you have like a personal financial planner sitting down with you. You might have like a minimum amount of, this is like a hard paternalism, minimum amount of non-zero 401k savings rate, which is just force people to save. And it's important to say it's not just about paternalism versus no paternalism. Once you get into the paternalism realm, it's actually very hard to figure out what should you do because there's so many different options and it's hard to tell which one is better than the other. More generally, even, it's actually quite hard to come up with any like non-paternalism option. That is to say, you can think of like all the options that are there. In some sense, once you think that defaults affect people's decisions, the no savings default is also a form of paternalism. In some sense, you say you choose something for people, and that's going to push them to not save, or you choose a high, like there's nothing special about the zero. You also have a 10% savings default, and so it's almost like regardless of what, it's important to understand that regardless what choice you choose, you're going to affect people's choices and their behaviors in certain ways. And so that sort of means essentially that you have to take a stance in which you sort of affect people's behavior. In a way, just saying like, we're just choosing a zero savings default is in some sense just a cop-out because even the zero savings default is affecting people's behavior quite a bit. So in a way, the discussion should rather be about like, what is the optimal way or the optimal paternalism, soft paternalism, I would argue, rather than sort of saying paternalism versus not. Because regardless of what option you choose, you're going to affect behaviors in certain ways because precisely the way you provide information to people on the default frames, etc., affect people's choices. Does that make sense? So here's a very quick example of like a very useful and helpful example of libertarian paternalism that has been quite successful. So Thaler and Bernardi were asked to design a 401k savings for a company that wanted to increase its employees' savings. So the company hired a financial advisor. The employees could sit down with the advisor to evaluate their financial situation plan. So for those who agreed to talk to the advisor, he, I guess in this case, recommended a savings rate. Some agreed to implement this. And then Bernardi and Thaler got the leftovers. So that's arguably a group that's sort of negatively selected towards saving a lot. Now, what's then the smart, the Save More Tomorrow plan? Employees were then approached about increasing their contribution rate a considerable time before the next scheduled pay raise. So that's to say, before the next scheduled pay raise, they were essentially asked about whether they would like to join voluntarily, and if they wanted to do, their contribution to the plan was going to be increased beginning with the first paycheck after the raise. So that's to say, if I told you like in December you're going to get a pay raise, would you like to increase your contribution then once you receive that pay raise? And so then you could choose like there's a preset maximum, and then what would happen is the contribution rate would automatically increase over time with each pay raise that you would receive. Like suppose your pay raise is like say 5% or 3%. What you would get then is like, suppose it's 3%, you would get like only like a 2% increase in your pay, and 1% or 1 percentage point of your pay would then go towards the retirement contribution. Importantly, the employee can opt out of the plan at any point in time by essentially just making a phone call or the like. Now, why is this plan a libertarian paternalism? Well, because of aspects 2 and 4, right? It's voluntary, so you can do whatever you want. You don't have to choose this at all. You can essentially decline it. You can also opt out at any point in time. So it's arguably nobody is made worse off, because you essentially what we're doing here is increasing people's options by saying, here's an option for you to like increase your saving automatically over time, and you can leave it out. You can leave it whenever you would like to do. So arguably, nobody should be worse off by this, and potentially some people are made better off quite a bit. And that's exactly what you see here. Essentially, when you look at the people who joined the SMART plan, notice that this is not random here. So there's some concerns about identification, but setting that aside, if you look at the people who, again, like arguably are negatively selected, these are people who declined the financial consultant. They essentially increased their savings dramatically as a consequence of this SMART plan. And now the SMART plan has been introduced or implemented in quite a few places. But anyway, that's not the point here. I want to sort of say what's good about the plan is while it's a SMART plan, not just because of the acronym, but also because it's using behavioral principles or stuff that we learned in class quite a bit and carefully. So what are these principles? So why is this a useful plan to use? And I'm going to sort of show you again what the plan is. What's clever about this plan? What is it using carefully? By the way, I don't know if you can hear this background noise. This is my neighbor has engaged in various home improvement projects since the quarantine. I've so far refrained from complaining about it because I don't know what's going on in their lives otherwise, and maybe that's sort of a way of dealing with stress and so on. You can get this. The default, once you opt in, the default is for your pay rate the contribution rate to increase. So the default is essentially working towards increasing people's savings. Okay, so there's 2 things going on here. One is present bias, where you say, well, yeah, in the future I want to save more. So precisely that's kind of great because now like the future self will be virtuous and so on. So if people are present bias, that will help. And then there's also just the part that's about paycheck increases. Remember, people tend to be loss averse. So what this plan is also accomplishing is like, so if I'm asking you right now today, would you like to increase your savings rate? Well, not only are you present bias, but also you're going to have like a cut in your paycheck, and people hate cuts in their paychecks. So instead it's saying like, well, in the future, your raise will be lower and people are less averse to reducing those increases compared to experiencing pay cuts. So that's, I think, what we have here. So this is essentially present bias is helping. Then there's reference dependence. And then there's defaults that help people switching out or some form of present bias. But people, precisely as we said previously, people are not switching out of those kinds of plans. So if you think that's a good thing to increase people's savings, here that's happening because people might actually procrastinate switching out of it once they're in the first place. So that seems to be like a great example, because not only is it preserving libertarian, or is it preserving people's free choice and not people making people worse off, but also it's using in a smart way behavioral principles. Okay, well, let me briefly talk about the market. And we talked about this a little bit already previously, but I want to sort of make this explicit. So one argument that often comes, in particular out of is, well, if people have self-control problems or other issues, well, will not the market come up with some goods or some solutions that will help people, right? After all, there's like money to be made in improving people's choices. So if really self-control problems or the like are really important, why is not anybody coming up with a market solution and sort of a great product that helps people, and then they're going to make a lot of money from doing so? And so, in particular, if consumers are sophisticated, then they demand ways to change their consumption, and then there will be somebody who's providing that good. And if the welfare effects of those kinds of self-control or other distortions are large, well, then you can make a lot of money from helping people improve their behavior. So what's problematic with this line of argument? Well, the market is precisely part of the problem. Well, so on the one hand, you sort of say, if you try to, so this is if you Google, and this is quite a while ago, but right now it's in some sense more sophisticated ways, and there's lots of targeting going on. But if you Google impulsive credit card spending, what you're going to get is a bunch of advice to help you with that. But at the same time, you also get a bunch of credit card offers that, or like you're going to get targeted eventually by companies that try to essentially precisely exploit you. So on the one hand, there will be a side of the market who will potentially help you, but there's another side of the market who will want to exploit you. And importantly, what the market will do is firms will try to target naive people, and you might remember this from lectures 5 and 6, where essentially firms precisely try to find people who are perhaps less sophisticated financially in other ways. So the firms are precisely trying to target naive people because those are the people you can exploit. Moreover, the naives are the ones who will think, well, I don't have any problems, so I don't actually need any goods or any sort of products that might help you. So not only are they being targeted by people who try to sort of screw them over, but also they actually are reluctant to seek help because precisely they think they're naive and they think it's not even necessary to seek help. So even a firm who wants to help has trouble making money with this because people, if they're naive, will not necessarily understand that help is required. And that's precisely the tension that we see in many markets, where there's some firms who might want to help and support, in this case, self-control. That's also true for other issues. But there's, on the other side, firms that try to break down the self-control from consumers precisely because they can make a bunch of money from that. And so now, the second part then severely limits the market's ability to provide self-control because it essentially too forced to set work. Now, the government, of course, can sort of try to address this, and this is what behavioral I/O would be about. Behavioral I/O would be about saying industrial organization, which would be, well, there's behavioral consumers, there's firms to try to exploit consumers. Now, the government is trying to support, or like by some form of regulation, trying to help customers, in particular things like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and so on, trying to help consumers not to get exploited by banning advertising, by capping interest rates, and so on and so forth. Or also by, for example, mandating disclosure, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to say one final thing about nudges, which is, on the one hand, we talked about nudges in the sense of saying, look, there's some behavior that we're trying to improve, which would be like, suppose people keep forgetting certain things, to take their medication or to appear in court. Let's send reminders to improve behaviors. You can set defaults in certain ways and so on and so forth, which is policies to improve good behaviors, assuming that the person who makes those choices is benevolent in certain ways. Now, on the other hand, of course, firms can use the same techniques and the same approaches to do the exact opposites and to harm people. And this is what Thaler and Sunstein call sludges, which essentially is like using these nudges in bad ways by trying to push people in wrong directions. So an example of that would be offering rebates on a product and then having people, customers, to require to mail in forms and the like. And you may have encountered these and wondered, like, why I have to mail in this form, and this is kind of tedious, and then you end up not doing it. The company wants you to think, oh, I'm getting like this great discount, and then actually never send it in, because then they don't have to actually pay. They can sell you the good, but then you don't have to actually, they don't have to give you the discount at the end of the day. So there's a bunch of types of cases, both from the private sector, but also from the public sector, such as things as voter registration. When you think about it, why is voter registration hard in certain places? Well, the reason why it's hard is because certain parties or groups do not want certain types of groups of people to vote. And those are essentially deliberate ways of making it hard for people to make choices that are arguably good for them or for society. And that's what Thaler and Sunstein would call sludges. And then here it's important to realize that it's in fact identifying and eliminating such sludges, which essentially are certain ways that make it hard for people to make good choices for themselves or for society, can be equally important, or perhaps as important, as sort of implementing nudges to improve people's behavior in certain ways. So it's not just about sort of taking behavior where people on their own screw up in certain ways and trying to improve them and trying to help them, but rather helping people being misdirected in certain ways to be exploited. And in many cases, in particular in companies, identifying those kinds of sludges and calling companies out gets you pretty far in some sense on social media and the like. Once called out, companies often back down and try to reduce them because they don't want to have bad reputations of exploiting customers. Okay, so let me sort of summarize the lecture and then briefly, in 2 minutes, the whole class. Some forms of, in particular, soft paternalism can ambiguously improve welfare, and we should be quite excited about them, and they can help quite a bit. Now, on the other hand, nudges can also make things worse, in particular if the government doesn't know what's good for people, and we want to be careful in nudging. And then, there's some examples I haven't in class, but there's also some examples of nudges actually backfiring. Now, in addition to that, some people dislike being nudged, and we should respect that and take that into account. We're trying to maximize utility, remember, as opposed to like certain behaviors or take up of certain outcomes. And we want to be careful not to make people worse off, and helping people opt out of certain nudges or certain interventions should be quite helpful. In addition, the market does not solve everything. So we should not have faith in like the market solving things. In particular, the market might make things worse. Finally, reducing sludges can go a long way in improving behavior overall. Now, big picture summary of this class. What is it in one slide that I want you to take away and have learned? Of course, things are more complicated, but let me give you like a very brief summary. So one, psychological considerations can be quite important in a lot of economic choices and behaviors, and we should take them very seriously. For you personally, I think that means in some ways understanding your own biases and mistakes and issues better and try to improve decision-making seems quite important. That's true for short run or simple sort of considerations, such as, how to deal with procrastination and exercising and so on. It's also true for long run considerations, like which jobs do you want to have, which friends do you want to keep, and so on and so forth. Could make you happy or unhappy in the future, and you want to be quite mindful about that. Small changes or like thinking about things for a while can make big differences. So I think I very much encourage you to introspect, be more mindful in your choices. As I said last time, experimenting, seeking advice, including psychological support and so on, seem to be quite helpful. At the same time, you also shouldn't stress too much and sort of just try to be happy and don't be too harsh on yourself. Often people are doing quite well already overall. It's also worth understanding that sometimes it's actually easier to help your friends or others than yourself. It's often easier to see in others how they're misoptimizing and how to improve their behaviors. So in some ways, helping others might be, in fact, one of the things you might have taken away from this class. And then finally, you want to think about, in particular, when you think about like designs of teams, working with others, incentives, products, and so on, if you try to design an app or any website or so on, thinking about psychological considerations of designing things carefully is quite important, and you should take those things into account. Somebody was asking about books to read, so I just sort of added them here. I was planning to say a little bit more, but I'm sort of out of time, so I'm just leaving this here. I'll try to add like a couple of sentences for each of them. There's some quite amazing books that you can read. In particular, for example, Cialdini's 93 Influence books is an amazing book to read. Then Ariely has really nice books, including Predictably Irrational. Some of these are more basic than others. If you're interested in poverty, Mulanathan and Shafir's Scarcity book is really an amazing read. And then Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow is also like extremely insightful and interesting. Of course, there's other books. For example, Dick Thaler talks about the history of behavioral economics. Lewis is what's called the Undoing Project, which is about Kahneman and Tversky's friendship and how they sort of essentially came to, in some really important ways, revolutionizing some parts of economics. So there's lots of things to read. If you're interested in any of these, just let me know. I'm very happy to chat. So that's pretty much all I had to say. I had lots of fun teaching this class. I know this semester was tricky and difficult. For many of us, every time I teach this class, I'm surprised how much I learned. I hope you learned some useful things too. I guess this is from last time, so there's no course evaluations this year. We might do an informal one to just learn and try to think about, learn more about what you thought. We did already an informal evaluation, but that was sort of in some sense assuming that there would be actual evaluations this semester. Unfortunately, MIT has sort of canceled them this year. I think to be mindful for some people are particularly affected by the quarantine and so on. Come to my office hours if you have questions. Have some Europe opportunities. Some of you have already applied to those. There's been quite a bit of interest. So if you have already applied, I'll get back to you soon. But in any case, come and talk to me. If you're interested, I hope you learn more economics in the future. I hope you take psychological considerations in those economic issues quite seriously. So thank you very much.